Hello, everyone. My name is Brit, and we're going to get our panel for today started. And we're going to start with having each of the panel members introduce themselves and share a little bit more about their participation with today's panel. And we are very excited to have the panel that we're going to have for you folks today. To start, we really want to make sure that folks know that this is a safe space to ask questions and to really kind of help us make this also a brave space where we're going to be sharing information about our own journeys and struggles really with toxic masculinity, what that means. And we're going to kick it off with Dr. Minero, who's going to introduce herself and share a little bit more about what she's going to be discussing for today.
Hey, thank you so much to the Center OC for having me and for having us, for having this great topic discussion that we're going to be talking about today. I just want to make sure, can folks hear me okay? All right, perfect. So my name is Lana Minero. I received my PhD in counseling psychology last year. And a lot of my current work right now at the UCLA Semel Institute for Neuroscience and Human Behavior actually focuses on working with LGBTQ youth and families. So we have a full LGBTQ affirming, gender affirming clinic where we provide services to youth and families. We do a group. And I also develop LGBTQ curriculum and content for LA County and their partnership with the Center of Prevention Center of Excellence. And we develop all their trauma-informed LGBTQ affirming curriculum and courses. So be on the lookout for those. I also developed the Spanish language content for them. So we're gonna have a Spanish language course coming out as well. So really excited to be here and get to do this work and talk about, toxic masculinity, how we challenge that within ourselves, within our families, within our communities. So it's just such a pleasure to be here, and shout out to Jackie, who's one of my college friends who I've known for a long time and invited me to be here. So thank you so much.
Thank you so much for introducing yourself. And next we're going to have Elijah introduce themselves for you folks.
Hello, everyone. My name is Elijah Hayek. My pronouns are they, them, he, him. I'm a trans masculine Lebanese immigrant, and I reside in Northern California on Carquinoloni land. Along with actively working to continue unlearning toxic masculinity, I'm a pre-law student. My focus is critical legal studies and constitutional law. In my free time, I am a non-denominational minister, and I serve the QT5 community. And I focus primarily on spiritual ministry. I also self-identify as a social justice activist and an abolitionist, let that be known. I transitioned in 2015 was when I officially acknowledged my trans identity and transition. So it's been 6 years now. And then 4 of those years were on HRT. So I just want to also share that I spent the majority of that time living as a stealth transgender masculine person. Yeah. Contributes in a lot of dynamic ways to unlearning toxic masculinity and participating in it as well. So excited to be here, and I look forward to talking with everyone else about such an important topic.
Thank you so much for sharing that. And we'll be talking a bit more about what stealth means later, I'm sure. And next we have Lana, who will be introducing herself as well.
Hi, everyone. Taking you all to like a groovy 70s trip with the lights going on here. Had to kind of improvise. But I'm Lana Patel. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I'm the senior community coordinator for Plume. And for folks who don't know what Plume is the first digital healthcare company that's for trans folks, by trans folks. Half of the staff are trans, and the co-founder of the company is a trans medical provider as well. And I have a lot of thoughts around toxic masculinity. As someone who is a MAB, assigned male at birth, I have been in transition for 15 years now. And also someone who's like a first generation American with Afro-Indo-Caribbean family and parents, and who are immigrants. Definitely seen a lot. And then also through my experience of dating as someone who is, I don't know how I would coin my sexuality per se. I guess it's leaning more like straight, but like it's open. I've just never had an opportunity to like be with someone other than like the cis men that I've encountered. But I've definitely encountered a lot of toxic masculinity as a trans woman dating cis men. But yeah, like everyone else was speaking of, I am an activist. I use my platform, especially social media, to speak out on a lot of the injustice going on in the community. I'm one that's fighting for equality, for reform, for abolition, and for a future where we just exist freely and openly. And thank you all for having me.
Thank you so much for being here. And then next we have Claudio, who's going to be introducing himself as well.
Hi, everybody. Yes, my name is Claudio, and I go by he, him, his. I am a Hispanic, a Mexican. I came to United States in 1994, so my English is still kind of not the best, but I'm working on. So I hope I make sense to you. And yeah, I am a father of 13. She just turned 13 on April. Transgender, my transgender daughter. Her name is Jasmine, and yeah. So it feels good to be here. You know, it feels good to be part of this panel, and I want to thank every single one of you for you know, make this happen. Um, the reason why I'm here is because you know, I love my daughter. I love my daughter, and so you know, ever since we transitioned, we did it when she was 4. I've been very active, you know, very active on this journey. So I don't know, you know, I'm a little bit nervous also. So but you know, more than anything, I'm excited, and like I say, I've been on this journey since she was 4, so it's been a few years now, and you know, I don't know about this topic, you know, I don't know what happened to me. I just know that, you know, being Hispanic and coming from where I come from, to be so open-minded about this particular, you know, about this is it's impressive. You know, it's just I don't understand. I still don't get why I'm so open-minded and so loving and accepting and just supportive. You know, I guess I love my daughter so much that all the stuff of macho man and you know, and the masculine side of myself is just it's gone. So yeah, so I'm here, and I'm looking forward to, you know, to listen to the rest of you, and let's have a good time. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for being here and for being part of this panel and contributing your stories to what we're going to be talking about today. There's some things that we're going to be talking about, and again, we really would just want to make sure that this is a safe space for folks and a brave space, and that people feel comfortable with sharing things about themselves and having an open and honest dialogue with one another. This is a very difficult subject. I think when we're trying to talk about toxic masculinity and what that means and what this looks like, there's going to be a good chance that we're all going to be thinking about our own stories and the own ways that we each have kind of been at the end of toxic masculinity, what that looks like, what that feels like. And I myself, my name is Brit. My pronouns are they, them, or he, him. I identify as transmasculine, non-binary, and queer. I was assigned female at birth and transitioned a number of years ago. I started my medical transition when I was, I think, like 24 years or 24 years old. But my social transition, I started it when I was 20. So it was later in life. And even being somebody that has had my own experience of being on the negative end of toxic masculinity, I still got caught up in it. And still it's what I've heard when I started my own transition was that masculinity is a prison, and in a lot of ways it can feel like that. And so today we're going to be kind of talking about what toxic masculinity is, what that looks like, what that feels like. Oftentimes folks are getting that confused with masculinity. That means that they can't be a masculine presenting person, but that's not the conversation that we're having today. Today is you can be a masculine person, you can be affirmed in your masculinity, and you can just make sure that it's not rooted in the oppression of feminine or femininity. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. And so what I really would like to kind of open up the conversation with our panelists and really with you folks that are here today is, what is toxic masculinity to you? How have you experienced this? How have you felt this? Whether this is like cultural or, as you've been navigating your transition or navigating the transition with a loved one, what is toxic masculinity to you? Is there anybody from our panel that would be interested in starting off with answering the question?
For me, toxic masculinity has been something that's very rigid, that can be very constrictive, and also kind of scary. As I stated before, I was assigned male at birth, and I saw toxic masculinity firsthand growing up, and being forced into masculine tropes and like having to perform masculinity as someone that was very androgynous, misgendered, that passed for like a girl or female up until puberty hit. And I think my family really pushed masculinity harder onto me because of those things. And for them, it wasn't just okay to like be masculine presented, but it had to be overtly masculine. It had to be, you have to go outside and play with boys and get roughed up and chase after girls and, you know, do all of this like extreme performative masculinity. And I think that aids into that toxic masculine culture. Oftentimes it is ingrained in children at a very young age. And there's this double standard of how you raise a boy versus how you raise a girl. Where it, even with babies, like you let uh, a baby fall, and if it's a male child, then they're supposed to like stay on the ground, cry. You're not supposed to pick them up or soothe them or like nurture them. And it's just always this like idea that like men or males are supposed to be like tough. They're supposed to be able to take it. They're not allowed to show weakness or like vulnerability, sensitivity. Like those are like negative things, and those are feminine things, and like men are not allowed to have those thoughts or feelings. And so as folks get older, and what I've noticed, you know, in my adult life dealing with men, is that it manifests into like hyper masculinity that becomes toxic masculinity, where it's a lot of repressed feelings and just a lot of trauma that comes out in other ways. And a lot of it is like oppressing other people or being harmful or abusive and violent. And then there's like these microaggressions that come along with it too as a trans woman. And really just like feeling unsafe sometimes, you know, like as a trans woman, my safety is, I question that sometimes, right? When dealing with toxic masculinity and with cis men, because there is a sense of kind of like tiptoeing around people in order to make sure that like I'm fitting the status quo and that I am palatable to people, that I'm presenting myself in a way that isn't going to put me in harm's way and that isn't going to subject me to toxic masculinity.
Thank you so much for sharing all of that, Millie or Lana. There are some things that I kind of picked up from you in terms of navigating masculinity and kind of what that looks like. And I think that there are some things that we're socialized to do, right? That masculinity is a certain way. And I think gender in a lot of ways is a performance. We are all kind of socialized to perform our gender in a certain way, and it needs to be recognizable to other people. But the hard part about toxic masculinity is that it's very oppressive. And it's not just for men, or masculine people, it's for anybody that's kind of interacting. There's a book called The Will to Change by Bill Hooks that is just it kind of speaks to that a bit, that we are all at the end of toxic masculinity, whether it's within ourselves or whether it's coming from other people. And Elijah, during your introduction, you had mentioned something about being stealth. Did you want to talk a bit more about what that meant and kind of why you felt that you needed to be a stealth person?
That was a perfect segue because it's definitely something I wanted to touch on. Excuse me. Stealth is when a trans person in a trans context, living stealth is trying to pass as a cisgendered person so that you're not pinned as a transgender person. And the reason that a person would live stealth would be for a multitude of reasons, primarily for safety, for gender affirmation, and I think it's also been acknowledged as just to ensure that you're valid in your identity, and that in and of itself comes from toxic masculinity. Living stealth has everything to do with toxic masculinity. For me personally, I was assigned female at birth, and when I came out as trans and began the social process, I kind of went on an extreme route. I chopped my hair. I instantly tried to masculinize everything about my appearance. Worked really hard on deepening my voice. Don't recommend it to anyone. It's very strenuous. And I just needed other people's affirmation. And when people were pinning me as trans, I wasn't getting that affirmation. So living stealth is not letting other people know, because I want to be treated at the time just as every other guy. And that comes from a lot of misplaced teachings and like toxic traits of masculinity in what it exists now, you know, stemming from patriarchy, patriarchal standards, and cisgendered heterosexual male standards. And it's very violent, you know. It imposes a lot of binary standards that cause so much harm. And so living stealth, you actually participate in all of those things in toxic masculinity, because in order to be acknowledged as male, masculine in a cisgendered standard, you have to act in the same way. You have to have the same mannerisms, the same thoughts. And what that ends up doing is creating harm for the person and for other folks. Because as you live stealth, other people don't know that you're trans, and you may be also harming other trans folks, which is ultimately, I think, why I decided to stop living stealth. I ended up having a coworker at one of my workplaces, and I participated in toxic masculinity within a conversation with some other folks where they were talking about transgender folks. In order to get my affirmation and my acceptance, I was causing harm to my own community, and we had a transgender coworker that overheard and, you know, was harmed in that process. And I never want to make another person like me feel the way that that felt for me. And so for me to perpetuate that through toxic masculinity, it wasn't a good feeling. It's just incredibly harmful. So participating in toxic masculinity was living stealth and perpetuating the same things that had harmed me in the past and continuing a cycle. So hopefully that answers your segue.
Thank you so much. And the next question that I kind of wanted to ask for Claudio and Dr. Minero, you kind of talked a bit about culturally, and when we're talking about toxic masculinity, there's also a cultural component to it as well. And did either of you want to kind of start with kind of speaking a little bit about what that kind of looks like from a cultural perspective?
Sure, absolutely. I think that question gets a little bit tricky because I think, you know, in other spaces that I've been, like, folks automatically go to, machismo, and it's Latinx culture. Other folks of the global majority are identified as, you know, having displays of toxic masculinity without the recognition that toxic masculinity is actually born out of white supremacy and colonization, right? And so many of these cultures were actually matriarchal before colonization. And so I just want to name that because I think it's important right up front, right, to name like what some of the issue is, what some of the historical context is, and also acknowledge that toxic masculinity exists across all, right, cultures, across all places of the world. And that, again, is a manifestation of colonization worldwide. I think, you know, for me, I've definitely experienced, you know, both been a recipient of toxic masculinity, and also even as a queer, gender expansive, Latinx woman, like, I still have to check myself too on how I have fed into certain ideologies, right, that in many ways privilege me or I just wasn't aware of. I like to give this example because I think it's pretty clear, but we don't think about it as, you know, like, oh, how is that toxic masculinity, right? But I remember there was someone that I had been dating for a long time, and she was a woman identified, and she she wanted to cut her hair, and I really don't know, like Claudio's saying, like, I don't know how I've been so supportive. And I'm like, one of the things that came up for me was like, oh, but I really love you with your long hair. I really love this like feminine gender expression that you have. And I remember like kind of catching it in myself, but I still like expressed my opinion. And it was really amazing because later on I talked to my mom, which is funny because my mom does this to me all the time. Like, she prefers me with long hair, and I've had really short hair. I've had all the hair. But for my mom to check me on this, she was like, she's able to do what she wants. Why are you telling her what to do? And it was just like this moment of like, yeah, what the hell is that about? You know, and I think for me, when I reflected on that further, it linked back to toxic masculinity for me. And this is how I would like you to express yourself. But yeah, I don't want anyone telling me what to do, right? So I feel like it's like moments like that that allow us to reflect on how we can approach, right, our relationships, the ways that we engage with each other, what standards we have for ourselves, what standards we have for other people, and the way we treat each other inside relationship and outside relationship. Like that's the ways in which this manifests and comes up for me. And I'm constantly needing to ask myself, well, like, where is this idea, right, that my partner should have long hair come that put on me? So why the heck am I putting that on, right? So I think just reflecting on that is consistently important for me when I see that come up. And to be honest, I feel like at the point again about the cultural piece, like I have like the worst perpetrators that I've seen of this are white cis men. So I just want to name that. I literally, the last time, and I think I mentioned this to my fellow panelists when we met before this, that the last time I did a panel on masculinity, it was literally it was LGBTQ identified folks doing a panel on toxic masculinity, and there was a white man that literally became really aggressive in the audience towards another gay identified Latinx male. And he started to attack him. And he was like, you didn't talk about how you're toxic. Why didn't you talk about that? And he became the whole event. He took over the entire event. He was standing up. He kept walking in and out of the room aggressively. We actually somebody had to come to figure out what was going on, and he even got to the dean. Like it just became this huge thing, and I've never seen that kind of behavior from other people. I've seen this consistently from white cis men, so I do want to name that. I think this comes up in small ways too, like whenever you invite trans, non-binary, two-spirit women of color to present, and then those presenters say, does anybody have any questions about what we presented on? And I've consistently seen white cis men get up and then not ask any questions, just literally mansplain and say what the presenters literally were here to present on. Or then they like talk about their theories or their business or their organization and have nothing new to contribute. So that to me is a manifestation of toxic masculinity. And when you see those things, I think it's important to call people in to describe, right, the interpersonal dynamics that are happening, because they land on people so aggressively, so painfully, so hurtfully, right? And that needs to be acknowledged.
Thank you. You brought up a lot of really great points in that. And before I kind of ask another question, I wanted to see if Claudio, if you had anything that you wanted to add. I know that you mentioned earlier that your love for your daughter, that the machismo that you felt before is gone. Did you care to kind of expand on that a little bit more?
Sure. Well, as I said at the beginning of this, and I'm still learning so much just about the whole everything, related with LGBTQ, and I was, and I'm still, like I say, I'm still learning. And so I had the concept of toxic masculinity was a something, and something that, being male myself, that I supposed to be a have the control and being a dominant, and to have, like, how can I say it, that I had this concept of just being the man, and I by listening to some of you and by reading some things here, I came up with, you know what, I always had the wrong idea, you know, and I'm not the toughest guy that I thought I was for a long time, you know. So when I find out that I had a transgender daughter, like I say, everything changed for me right then, and and I'm still like a little bit confused. I'm still learning, you know. But like I say, it comes down to me like all these ideas, you know, that I had since I was a kid. Um, they pretty much they went out the window, you know, when I started coming to the groups, you know, the support groups at the center in Children's Hospital in LA. Um, I, I came up to tell myself, you know what? I didn't know anything, you know. I didn't know anything about LGBTQ, and so I'm still confused a little bit. You know, all I know is that I'm here to do whatever I gotta do. You know, to support the community. You know, and words and names and pronouns. You know, at the to me at the end, it really doesn't matter what I'm looking for is just to get to know you as a person and anybody out there. You know, when I go to schools, when I go to places and share my story, you know, I don't really pay attention anymore on, you know, um, male, female, or in between or whatever, you know, whatever the case is. I just wanted to support anybody, you know, within this umbrella. And so anyways, I hope it makes sense. And again, I'm still learning, and I'm still there's a lot to learn, so thank you.
Thank you so much. And so a few things as I was listening to folks talk, three things that I kind of wanted to bring up, and we can have more discussions around it. So the first is white supremacy and its role in toxic masculinity. Also the gender binary and its role in toxic masculinity. And then lastly, women also, and women and feminine people also being tools in upholding toxic masculinity. I think that these are really important conversations to have, and it's difficult and uncomfortable. But I think what's important, and something that Claudio there just brought up, is it's okay to not know. It's okay to not be perfect in your pursuit in dismantling the gender binary and white supremacy and toxic masculinity. What is important is that the attempt is there and that the efforts are still being made. And it's growing is uncomfortable. It's oftentimes uncomfortable. It is something that is, but it's also something that's ongoing, and it's so very important because we want to show up for folks in our lives. We want to make sure that we're doing it in a way that feels appropriate and in a way that feels like we're seeing that other person. And so with that, I kind of wanted to see if we wanted to have a little bit more of a conversation about the gender binary, white supremacy, or really how really, and there was a question in the chat as well about what white cis men can do differently to be supportive in spaces. And really, I'd like to open up this conversation to any of the panelists that are interested in kind of speaking to any of those things at all.
I actually, I was thinking about this question in particular um, when it comes up in general, and then in the context of toxic masculinity within the LGBTQIA plus community also. Um, and ultimately, white supremacy occupies toxic space of the gender binary and of assigned gender roles And then it creates this like danger. It just creates generally dangerous situations for folks who express themselves outside of that. And what I mean by that is white supremacy is equally tethered to a very specific type of Christianity. And that is super foundational for the gender roles. And that looks a lot like responsibility being set one way, and also acknowledging that gender looks like M and F, you know, and so that it's simplified, there's a clear line, and anything that falls outside of that is instantly met with a repercussion. And the dangerous situations that are created of that is anyone wanting to express themselves in a different way and doesn't fit these traditional right modes of expression or assignment experience pushback from family in public. There's not a space that is safe. There's not, and there's also not, the best way to put this is it creates kind of a snowball effect where you're teaching the folks that, or you're insinuating that the folks who step outside of that will always be met with violence. And so you either conform or bad things will happen. And toxic masculinity tethered to white supremacy is an incredible amount of violence. And we see this constantly with the amount of lives that are lost for trans folks specifically. And just, it really just stems from gender roles being set up a very specific way. And I think it's important to recognize those things and ensure that you yourself are holding space for variation, and that just because it's new for you doesn't mean it's too extreme. You know, I just want to throw it out there that when folks first started hearing about they them pronouns, it would turn into such a horrible conversation of why, you know, why do they want to be different? And it's not different, it's just understanding that there is variety that exists. Narrowing into a binary variation is not diverse and is not realistic, because violence has been the only thing sustaining that. And the tool is toxic masculinity, you know, but the toolbox itself is white supremacy.
I really love the way that you said that the tool is and there's a tool and there's toolboxes. And Lana, did you have anything that you were interested in saying, or any talking points that haven't been brought up, or something that you wanted to potentially expand on?
Yeah, I really that last part really resonated with me. You know, the tool in the toolbox, and I think that, you know, we live in a patriarchal society for sure, right? And we see the ways in which white supremacy and colonization has impacted us globally. And it has set up very rigid norms and standards for how we navigate space, which we are trying to overthrow, we're fighting. But there's also consequences for not adhering to the status quo or to these ideas of what masculinity looks like and what femininity looks like. And I think that's where a lot of toxic masculinity lies. It's almost as if it comes in a way to punish those for not practicing masculinity the way it should be, and also punish those for trying to express something outside of like the quote unquote norm. And I think ways in which we can dismantle that are holding like truth to power, you know, holding folks accountable, and then also coming up with like tangible things that can be done, right? Like figuring out what does a world without toxic masculinity looks like? What does healthy masculinity looks like? Because polarity is still a thing that exists, right? You know, there's masculinity, there's femininity, there's the beautiful spectrum in between. But there is a beauty between, you know, the masculine realm and the feminine realm. But toxic masculinity is something that needs to be eradicated altogether. And I think, you know, we really need to hold folks accountable for encouraging toxic masculinity and continuing to perpetuate a lot of the stuff that's happening, right? The toolbox that you spoke so eloquently to, Elijah. I think that it's a conversation that needs to continue to happen, but we also need to get to a space where those who are in power, those who are elitists, those, you know, people who have that like seat and throne within white supremacy, really change the ways in which they are kind of perpetuating and pushing this. But and then when I take a deeper dive into it, you know, when you spoke of religion, Elijah, I think of things as well, like, you know, the Bible that's been around for thousands of years, right? And that is a book that so many people use to continually push their, you know, this whole ideal of what masculinity and femininity looks like. And when we look at the lens of like queerness and folks in the community, it's also weaponized against us. It's something that's often quoted to say like this book that's been here for so many years, that, you know, our Lord and Savior, our God, you know, our prophets that either are quoted in this book or wrote this book, they have blatantly said that this is how a man should look, how he should act, and we don't accept, you know, anything outside of that. And I think that is something that needs to be tackled as well. And I don't know what that conversation looks like and how we address that, as it's been something for thousands of years. You know, we've been I mean, this country's, you know, been kind of founded on like Protestants, but I think that's something that we need to kind of look at and restructure and refigure. I do know, you know, we have affirming churches and pastors and people that are moving away from that, but I think those that are still working within white supremacy are using a lot of that rhetoric and a lot of the language that was written in those books to validate and legitimize a lot of their trauma.
A lot of really great points, and thank you so much for sharing. As you were talking, there was actually a question in the chat that I think is really interesting, and kind of speaks to a little bit of what folks have been sharing already. And the question is, do you think toxic masculinity is firmly rooted in the church? Would it exist in culture as it does, if not for religion's prevalence? And can it be separated? And I think kind of starting with this question is really kind of acknowledging the role that religion plays with gender roles. And Lana has already spoken to it. A few of the other panelists have already spoken to it. And when we're talking about gender is culturally constructed, meaning that it is different across cultures. And an example of that just in modern day times is California. We have 3 legally recognized gender: males, females, and non-binary. Whereas you can look at Texas, which only has male and female. So our understanding and our legal recognition of gender is different. Same country, different states, different understandings of what that means, different legal recognition for these different genders. So when we're talking about gender, we have to acknowledge that it's going to look different. It looks different now, and it's going to look different in 10 years from now. And so when we're kind of taking a look at the history of gender and gender identity, when we're looking at Indigenous people, they absolutely had more than just male and female. They had recognized different genders outside of that. When you look at other cultures, they also recognize different genders than just male or female. And when we're taking a look at the histories within America and the indigenous people that lived on these lands, there were a lot of folks that were wanting to exist or were existing outside of the gender binary that the church was saying was the standard and how they needed to adhere to. Many of these folks were slaughtered, and they were taken out of existence for their refusal to adhere to these gender binaries of just male or female. So religion plays a really important role, a really toxic role in a lot of ways. And so kind of leading into answering this question, do you folks feel that it can be separated? And do you think that church can potentially be part of the healing process, even if at one point it was part of the problem?
So I'm gonna take first dibs on this for a lot of, I think, obvious reasons. So this is actually a subject that I discuss most often with folks, particularly being a non-denominational minister. And part of my focal point of my ministry is helping folks understand that there's still space for you because you exist. And for anyone that walks with a particular faith, has any understanding of whatever traditional Christian principles, values, maybe you need to understand that everything that you believe in church comes from, the Holy Bible, right? And understanding what the Holy Bible is will help you understand why church is the way that it is. And it delves down into how people want to understand it and how they want the lens that you use to understand what's written. And keep in mind that it's been translated so many times that the original context of what is written varies dramatically. And so with leading in with that, to say that existence kind of counteracts any other statement. The fact that you are here and the fact that you feel the way that you feel in your identity, in your expression, in your faith, in your personal life, and about literally anything about yourself, is validity and is affirming of your faith, and at the same time all of those components of yourself and all of those different parts of yourself. Because church talks about nothing occurs, without God's permission, or without, everything comes from God. And so you are valid in what you are. And there is a way to properly heal people from the harm and the damage of religion, because religion and faith are different. Religion is following a book to the letter with instructions that don't make sense most of the time, right? Unless you're anointed and putting on your actual eyes and seeing where there's performance versus where there's authenticity, you're able to guide yourself through your understanding of what church is. And in traditional Christian sayings, they say that the church is within you. And what that means is you carry that sacred place with you, and a place that does harm through religiosity and having a building and a set of rules that do harm and encourage others to do harm through reinforcing gender roles, masculinity, white supremacy. All of these things exist and are affirmed by the church. And through that harm, people veer away from it. And it's super understandable. I was one of those people. I mean, I still am. I would say that I still am. It is firmly rooted in the church, because whatever standard of traditional church and traditional anything pertaining to Christianity states that the woman came from the rib of the man, and so therefore there's a superiority complex from jump, from the beginning. And so you're already at a disadvantage. And any teaching that tells you that there is inequality and that inequality is favoritism to a man because of strength and all of these horrible things, I don't feel is sending, first off, a proper message. And second off, I don't feel that those particular places that do that can separate from toxic masculinity because they perpetuate it in everything they teach. So it is possible to separate that. And that has everything to do with what you're choosing to participate in and understand and believe. And part of white supremacy is standard Christian churches and faith and religiosity because of those things that it affirms, rather than places that don't do that. And there is a separation, and we see that it's possible. There's an enormous amount of places that affirm that and talk about inclusivity, and somehow, you know, like, it's still in existence, it's still there, so it's valid, right? And I think, sorry, crazy neighbors, wild neighbors, I apologize, it's not trauma-informed. The one last thing that I will say about this pertaining to the question is, like, would it exist in cultures if it wasn't for religion? Toxic masculinity would not exist, period. And Dr. Lauda has talked about white supremacy and colonization have everything to do with that. You know, a lot of cultures pre-colonization were matriarchal. There wasn't really these toxic gender roles. There were roles. Gender was not quite fabricated outside of reproductivity. And within those cultures, there was a lot of polygamy. I'm sorry, that was a wrong word. Polyamory. I'm not in school anymore. A lot of polyamory because the gender roles thing just didn't quite exist, and it maintained where it was highlighting femmes and females. So toxic masculinity has everything to do with religion, and that has impacted gender roles within many cultures and every culture that colonization has touched. So I think understanding where you're able to separate is really important to keep in mind too.
Any other panelists that'd be interested in adding to that or contributing to that at all? Oh, Claudio, were you looking to unmute yourself?
No, but I was just reading the messages. But anyways, I don't know. I'm just trying to you know, to understand everything that has been you know, we've been talking about, and you know, I was thinking, you know, I've been thinking about the church thing. I you know, I consider myself very blessed, very lucky, you know, and when I say that, it's basically I'm talking about me and my daughter, you know, because you know, I have been, all the experiences that I have had with her regarding church and how they you know, the church that we go to is I guess it depends where you live. You know, you were saying something about Texas. We are here in California, and I think that is a blessing. You know, I you know I you know I try to practice my you know, my religion the best I can, and so that was one of the fears of me. You know, when I started taking Jasmine to church on Sundays, and one of the fears, it was, you know, how she was gonna. She's very smart, you know, and we started, you know, Jasmine's mom passed away about 3.5 years ago, almost 4 years ago, so she was like 9, when she when she moved in with me, and I always go to church, so I take her to church with me, and then one of my biggest fears was that once we start to listening to like the Bible readings and some some readings, especially there's some readings that bring things up, like that, and she was I remember one time when we left after our service, she came out and she's like, Daddy, I will never come back to church again, and don't take me back here. I hate it. This is fake. um Please don't take me back, you know. And then I was, thanks to, like, I guess my willingness, to come to these groups and to go to therapy and to do all those things that we do, I was able to have a conversation with her about, what the church, how I see church, and how I see people in the church, and what I was, I was able to explain her, what there is some readings, there is something on their literature that is confusing even for me. I say, I'm a grown-up, and I get confused, but that's why I keep coming back. But I told you, and I say, but one thing I want you to know is that I want you to know and understand that God does exist. Because she's like, God doesn't exist. Why am I transgender? Why that I have to, like, you know feel different than other people? So yeah, and I say, you know what, if God didn't exist, well, this is me and this is my story. Just, I don't know, I believe in God. I'm a I practice my religion, and so I say, look, if God didn't exist, you wouldn't be here in California. You wouldn't be able to go to the groups that we go. You wouldn't be able to have the friends that you have and the support that you have, and to be where you are today. So, and then, I was able to go back to church the next week, and uh something happened there, that she, after that, then she was okay to go back again, but she was not convinced at all. Like, she was doing it to please me, I think, a few times. And then, it was just, it's just, but it's a tough place to be, um so I don't know, depending, for me, on my experiences, depending where you live, sometimes, which church you go to, because there's so many, different churches that you get confused now too. So it just depends on a lot of the people that you actually talk to in the church place. So um but I'm we're gonna I've been, working with Jasmine, and I'm just gonna continue, to 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 follow up with whatever is next. Whatever comes in, we'll take it, and we move forward.
Thank you so much. And there's a question from earlier that I think would be really great, as we're kind of winding down on our panel today, that if we wanted to kind of add some insights from maybe from our own experience, or from things that we'd like to share tonight as folks that are having a conversation. And that the question was, what can white cis men do differently to be supportive in these spaces? I mean, we've talked a lot about the connections between white supremacy, gender roles, colonization, and just all of these different things, intersectionality, and the way that they all contribute to toxic masculinity. Did anybody have any interest in maybe starting off that conversation about what can folks do? And maybe we can direct it towards cis white men, because I think they're maybe kind of the pinnacle of, like, of everything. They're at the crosshairs of what kind of contributes to toxic masculinity.
I'd be happy to start. I think it really requires a lot of self-reflection first. So really examining, right? Like, how do you benefit? How do you privilege from the patriarchy and the patriarchal system? And the devaluation of femininity and other expressions of gender. I think that's, I think I just want to say, like, segue a little bit. I think one thing that we didn't talk about was femphobia, which is the systemic devaluation of femininity and also the regulation of patriarchal femininity. And I think there's an inverse relationship between toxic masculinity and the ways in which we devalue expressions of femininity, right? Because you see this aggressive behavior, like the example that I gave earlier, towards gay or queer men, right? And I think that has a lot to do with the devaluation of how folks express themselves, or and how toxic masculinity kind of like goes after that, or devalues or attacks that, right? So one thing I think, aside from self-reflection, is also helpful, is to be aware of the space that you take up, whether that's physical space, and in conversations, right? At least I see this in Zoom too, so this was happening in person. Really interesting to see how, gender minorities would try to unmute themselves, and white men would like be the first to, like, the folks were muted for a long time ready to speak, but all of a sudden you would just see white men unmute quickly and then just start speaking. So even something like that, just sitting back, allowing yourself to observe and listen, and take a look around, see if somebody else whose voice may typically not be heard or may not be given space, just sit back and see if somebody else wants to speak. And I think this is something that can be done in person, and virtually. I also think it's important. Sometimes when you have so much privilege, it's really hard to be aware that you have it. So I would hit up my friends. I would hit up the people that love me and that are aware of these dynamics, and ask them to hold me accountable. I would ask them to give me feedback, not to educate me, right, but to give me feedback in the ways that I may or have been toxic, and or if it comes up, to hold me accountable to that. So that I don't want to take up more space, but those are some of the things that come up for me.
Thank you so much for those points. And I kind of want to echo a lot of those statements, or sentiments rather. I think we, as a general community and society, we need to have a seat at the table. I think that's really important. And I think that we need cis white men to, one, allow us to have a seat at the table, but also create tables, right? And open doorways and pathways, and to use their power and privilege to allow access for others, right? And that's why I think the conversation around equality and equity is so important. Equality is so important because, yes, we need to be treated equally, but equity is equally as important because it's what is fair. And for so long, so many minorities, whether femfolk, folks of color, especially Black femfolk, have not been given their equity. They haven't been given equality either, but we get to a place where we kind of have affirmative action. We feel like we're kind of doing something by tokenizing folks and having one in at the table and one in the conversation. But, you know, when we're looking at a lot of the political structures and like just the powers that be globally, a lot of them are cis white men that are kind of the ones in charge, right? We're looking at the Pope, we're looking at the president, we're looking at the Senate and the House of Representatives. And like, these are the people that are making decisions for us. And I think that they can do their part by allowing us to occupy those spaces, right? And bringing us up. I think it's really important that we make sure that like there are other voices and faces and identities that are in the room and that have access to make change, you know, tangible change and visible change. And I also feel that femphobia is a real thing, right? And transmisogynoir, as Ashley Marie Preston so eloquently speaks to, is this whole idea of this deeply rooted phobia, which is also inherently hatred and violence that's perpetuated towards trans women of color, predominantly Black trans women of color, right? And so I think we need to have radical conversations around like what does that look like, and especially when we speak of reform, we speak of abolition, and how we take down these structures of patriarchy and creating a system that allows us to really thrive and flourish as a society, and one that does not make necessarily white people, white men, white cis men, the enemy, but we hold them accountable because for so long they've been able to skirt by. They've been giving the most while we've been giving the least. And they have been able to thrive from the system, and they haven't done much to challenge it because it works in their favor. And I think that right there is where a lot of the toxic masculinity lies, and why we need them to really do the work to make sure that equity is being practiced in all places and in all spaces.
I've just
To
been
piggyback off of that.
Oh yeah.
Sorry, Brit.
I was just gonna say I'm taking notes so I can drop them in the chat after, but I'm just writing. Just you folks are making really great points, and I am very appreciative.
Yeah, actually, Lana was just talking about a lot of really good points. Actually, it's super hard to follow after that, but when I had initially seen the comment, I typed in the chat because I wanted to remind myself what I wanted to say, and literally all I wrote was to listen and to not take up space. You have to make it simple for them to understand, because the more complicated it becomes, the more confusing it is. And I'm not demeaning anyone. I'm literally just telling you how it is. And cis white men don't take up any space. If any person is in the room besides you, hand the mic over, give them the platform. Listening is, it's a simple task to tell someone, but it's difficult to do unless you have an open mind. And being open-minded is something not to expect of somebody, but to allow yourself to have a standard of. So not so much relying on the response that you get from them, but understanding that you setting an expectation is not something bad or something too much to ask of a specific person. You're just asking for something. The same way that there are standards for them. And I just want to say and affirm that all of these things are possible. Everything we've talked about, all of the subjects that we've touched on are plausible, right? We've talked about toxic masculinity, and when initially I was asked what it meant to me, the way that I chose to answer this question was just to say that toxic masculinity does not equate to anti-masculinity. You know, no one is coming after masculinity in general, we're redefining it as folks who have participated in it, as folks who have been on the receiving end of it. And more often than not, we're harmed more than we are benefiting from it. But everyone at some point in time will benefit from toxic masculinity. And all that it is aggression and harm. That's all that toxic masculinity is. It's just straight up aggression and harm. And it's nothing that yields any type of positivity or like, oh, there's an upside. There's no upside. You know, so it makes no sense to continue to perpetuate it. And being okay with masculinity looking different than what a traditional sense of masculinity was is the difference between masculinity and toxic masculinity. So I just want to throw that up.
Thank you. And Claudio, just before I kind of move into opening up for other folks, did you have anything that you would like to say? I don't want to put you on the spot at all, but if you're interested.
I think I'm good for now. Thanks.
Okay. I just wanted to ask before I move forward. So just kind of things that I wanted to kind of contribute to this and how we can all kind of work to dismantle things. And again, just reiterating, dismantle white supremacy and gender binaries within yourselves, within your little sphere of influence, and having these conversations with people. None of us really, or some of us, I think, are under the impression that we benefit from things, and Elijah already spoke to it. Folks think that they benefit from toxic masculinity, but are you really benefiting when, you know, when taking a look at what it costs to uphold that and to continue with that performance? I think folks that are masculine or male identified, getting caught up in that is very, very easy. I think when we're kind of having conversations about this, and like with my own experience of being somebody that was participating actively in upholding toxic masculinity, and I didn't even realize it. And it was even before I transitioned. I wanted to be seen for my sexual orientation as a person that liked women, and I felt that I had to act a specific way and you know, perform in a particular way to be seen for that identity. And it really only got worse as I transitioned and was seen as a male, or assumed as a male person because of my presentation. And so lastly, what I really would like to encourage folks that are men or that are masculine presenting is seek to heal. I think that there's a lot of things that we are kind of holding within ourselves as men and masculine people, and we are kind of socialized to say that, to share that or to speak to that or to acknowledge that we are hurting is a weakness, and it is not. And it's really, it's only hurting ourselves. And so I very, very much encourage folks that to reconnect with your feelings and whatever that looks like, finding folks that you feel comfortable with sharing things, wanting to get into therapy. I've been in therapy for over a decade at this point, and it's not a weakness of mine. It's a place where I can go and I can ensure that I'm working towards healing, because there's a lot of hurts and pain in this world, and you do not have to be holding on to that. And learning how to speak to your emotions instead of reacting is going to be how we all kind of move towards a space where folks are having healthy relationships with one another and with ourselves. And so kind of with that, we're about winding down to 7:30 p.m. And I really would like to open it up for any folks that are, either if you had questions or if you had something that you wanted to share before this panel ended. I really would love to invite you to kind of speak, or if you felt comfortable with that, as we would love to have community participation in this discussion. Is there any, so if there are no questions or anything that folks would like to say, is with our panelists, did you folks have anything that you didn't say or wanted to say before tonight was over? We have about 10 minutes.
I actually want to share a little bit about unlearning toxic masculinity, and that it will be literally a lifelong thing. I was really reflecting on the different ways that toxic masculinity has affected my life. And it has affected, you know, the way that I chose to present myself, being assigned female at birth, and not having healthy masculinity in my life looked a lot like developing characteristics of toxic masculinity as a femme presenting person at the time prior to my transition. And there were a lot of aggressive behavior, and that was equated to, oh, this is security, this is sturdiness, this is confidence. And you know, once I transitioned, it became like overly aggressive. And Brit and I have had this conversation actually a couple of times about, you know, being a person who loses touch with a feminine component, and then all of a sudden I'm perceived as an aggressive, hostile person. And what is that telling me? That masculinity can easily be something dangerous and toxic that can affect even the way that people present themselves, but also doesn't create space, as I had said earlier, about just doesn't create any space for variation, you know, something that's different. So growing up and not feeling like I fit a particular way, or I was presenting in the way that I wanted, toxic masculinity impacted my life in that I couldn't express myself openly. There isn't an avenue or a channel at the time where I could come out and say, hey, I'm trans. There's information present for me to even know what this terminology means. Yeah, and participating in toxic masculinity once I transitioned and began to pass as a cisgendered person. And I just want to note that I said that for the sake of the statement, but it's good to understand that it's not proper terminology to use, because we don't want to pass as cis people. We're not trying to pass as anything but ourselves. And we are masculine, we are feminine, we are non-binary, we are androgynous. All of those things exist, you know, without having to pass as anything. We're just ourselves. And living stealth and recognizing the ways that toxic masculinity exists, and just being in a lot of cis het male spaces was just horrifying, because it's a lot of aggression, but it's not like that when they're together. That toxic masculinity is reserved for public, for showing out, for imprinting onto kids. But when cisgendered men, cis heterosexual men are together, they don't act very masculine, just so you guys know. And this is dangerous. It's dangerous because it allows for like an elitist club to participate in a particular way, but it's not okay when it exists in the public eye, or where everyone can see that you're not masculine. And that's so good to call people out on. And I know we touched on, you know, having those conversations, but I really want to encourage you, especially if you are a cisgendered, masculine, or male identified person, have those difficult conversations with other cisgendered men, because we're perpetuating a violence by not addressing those things or having difficult conversations, because all we do is become passive. And we, as in my old self in these spaces, right? I was perpetuating harm. I was perpetuating harm against myself, my community, other folks, literally everybody else. And there is such a cost to that, where in the moment I'm being acknowledged, but by who? And who are they to me? And what does that momentary, it's like momentary gratification, but it's not long-term, it's not super affirming, because you're acting and it's exhausting. And 6 years later, I no longer identify as a trans man. I identify as a trans masculine person, because masculinity is completely different for me. And it wasn't until 2 years ago that I really gave myself time and space to work through my perception of my own masculinity and the way I wanted to be perceived and understood, and stepping away from living self and just being open and having those types of conversations, obviously when it's safe to do so, is helping me heal from the harms of toxic masculinity, from helping me recognize the ways that I participated in it that is harmful. I have moments with my partner where I say things that are incredibly out of pocket, and I like never thought about it. And so it's an ongoing education or a lesson or unlearning of toxic masculinity. I don't feel I'll ever be free of it, but I'm glad I am learning. I am glad that I have that desire, and I'm glad that I'm fostering spaces for myself and my friends and my family to understand what toxic masculinity looks like, what it means, because we shouldn't be perpetuating the same things of, I want things to be different, so I'm going to do my part. And that's really all that it is. Thank you for your time. Thank you for coming to the TED Talk.
So there's one last question in the chat, and that was how to promote advocates to the head of organizations that perpetuate toxic masculinity. For example, church pastors, ministers, sports coaches, college professors, business leaders. And does anybody want to answer that? So we have about 4 minutes left. So just a quick answer for that, and then we'll finish off for tonight.
If I could just sort of to flesh out the question, you know, a lot of these organizations, and thank you, first of all, for the space and for everything that everyone has shared. But it's just these organizations have historically perpetuated this, but also empowered those very same people that benefit from toxic masculinity to rise to the top. And even spaces like college classrooms, which are meant to be places of learning, are often organized and set up in a way that benefit male students or men in the classroom. So I'm just curious of how we could re-situate these organizations and people within them to disarm and defeat toxic masculinity.
I was just gonna say I'm glad you're speaking up, Nathan. I think there's certain people who are able to speak up, and those who will get backlash, and will have severe repercussions. I've experienced this in terms of doing anti-racist work, and like sometimes the system is so big, and if you don't have power in the situation, like that could be your livelihood. And I've always been a person who's like, I don't care about that. Like, I'll put my butt on the line. And then there are just some circumstances that the violence is so big that no matter what you do or you put yourself on the line, the change doesn't happen if it doesn't come from certain people. That's not to disempower people. That's to like, just be straight up about the power dynamics at play and why it is so critical to engage, right? As we said, white cis men, folks that do have power, folks that are, have maybe worked themselves up to really take this on as something that's important, because it's not just one thing, a one person thing. It's really about a cultural change and a cultural shift. So we really need everybody on board to know what this looks like. What does it manifest? So we're really talking about how do we be anti-patriarchal, right? The toxic patriarchal way. How do we actively resist against that as a collective? Because I've seen the backlash when you approach things individually as a quote unquote minority. I hate that word.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that something that I was thinking about with this is when you're speaking was learning when to take space and when to make space. And so when you're seeing things that that you are potentially in a position where you might have a bit more authority in that conversation or in that situation, knowing when to actually say something, and knowing when you're either going to be taking away from a space or contributing to a space. And so being acknowledging that the power dynamics and the influences that you might have as maybe as a masculine presenting person or as a male identified person, and somebody's being sexist or saying something that is inappropriate, and you as a masculine or male person know that you can speak up and you would get less backlash than somebody else who is femme or female identified. So it's really a lot about acknowledging your privilege and the position that you have in different situations, and knowing when to use it and when to be quiet and when to listen. And so with that, it is 7:30, and we are very grateful for all of you panelists for joining us today. I've had an excellent time listening to you, and I am always deeply appreciative of hearing your stories and the things that you have. And thank you to all of our participants for helping us create a space where we can all share things that are very private and vulnerable, and having these hard conversations. And I really hope that you join us in the future as we have other conversations, and that you folks are looking for ways to move forward and looking for ways to undo toxic masculinities in yourselves and within your spheres of influence. But thank you all so much for coming and joining us in this in this panel, in this conversation.